Imagine a world where the sun rises over thatched roofs and muddy paths in 920 AD, a world where justice is swift, often brutal, and sometimes incredibly unfair. Have you ever wondered what it was like to be a woman in that world, facing the law? Did a man and a woman truly stand equal before the judges, even for the same transgression? Let's peel back the layers of history and confront some unsettling truths about the scales of justice in a distant, forgotten time. Number 1. Verbal offenses and the silent tongue. In the dusty, bustling villages and small walled towns of 920 AD, every word mattered, but not every speaker was equal. For men, a sharp tongue might lead to a heated argument, perhaps a challenge to a duel in more martial societies, or even a hefty fine if their words damaged a reputation. It was often a matter of honor, a battle of wits, and standing among peers. For women, however, the very act of speaking out, of using their voice in a way deemed inappropriate, could invite punishments far more demeaning, far more physically intrusive, and undeniably more gender-specific. It wasn't just about what they said, but that they said it. Consider Dagmar, a woman from the quiet village of Oakhaven, as recorded in the local customs and bylaws of the Saxon villages, a parchment document diligently maintained by the local reeve. Dagmar was known for her quick wit and her even quicker tongue. She knew all the village goings-on, and perhaps sometimes she shared them with a little too much embellishment. One cold autumn, a rumor began to spread about the local miller, Theron suggesting he was short, changing his customers on flour. Dagmar, having heard whispers from several sources, repeated the claim at the village, while adding her own observation that his sack weighed suspiciously light the last time she visited. Theron, a burly and proud man, quickly caught wind of the slander. He felt his livelihood and his honor were under attack. Now, if a man, say Leif, had spread the same rumor, Theron might have challenged him to a public shouting match, perhaps even a scuffle, or demanded a formal apology before the village elders. The Book of Penalties, compiled by the Guild of Magistrates, a collection of customary laws and judicial precedents, notes several instances where men who slandered others were made to pay a compensatory sum of silver or provide a certain number of days of labor to the wronged party. Their punishment, while significant, usually addressed the damage to the slandered party's wealth or reputation directly, or aimed to re-establish social order through a demonstration of contrition or strength. But Dagmar's offense was seen differently. Her words were not merely an attack on Theron's honor. They were an attack on the very concept of a woman's place. A woman was expected to be quiet, submissive, and occupied with household duties. Her voice, if heard at all, should be one of obedience, piety, or gentle instruction within the confines of her home. The ideal woman, as outlined in the Chronicle of St. Gall Observations on Local Justice, often described a woman as silent, diligent, and virtuous in her inner thoughts, not her outward pronouncements. When a woman used her voice to spread discord, especially through gossip or critical remarks about a man, it wasn't just seen as slander. It was seen as an unseemly and dangerous deviation from her expected silence and submission. It threatened the entire social harmony, a ripple effect that undermined the very foundation of patriarchal order. So, when Theron brought his complaint against Dagmar before the village reeve, the reeve didn't consider a fine or a public apology sufficient. Dagmar's punishment was designed not just to correct her behavior, but to physically and publicly control her speech, to remind all women of their expected roles. She was sentenced to wear the scold's bridle for a full market day. This was a horrifying device, an iron contraption fitted over the head with a metal plate or spike that extended into the mouth, pressing down on the tongue. It prevented the wearer from speaking, inflicting pain with every attempted utterance. Dagmar was paraded through the village square, her head held high in silent defiance, but her tongue rendered useless. Children pointed, and villagers averted their eyes, though the message was clear to every woman present. This punishment was specifically, brutally, and humiliatingly gendered, reserved almost exclusively for women who were deemed common scolds or spreaders of malicious gossip. It was a tangible representation of the belief that a woman's unruly tongue needed to be physically restrained. Another form of verbal offense, sometimes seen as minor in men but major in women, was nagging or persistent complaining within the household. While a man might be seen as merely expressing his displeasure or making demands, a woman doing the same was often perceived as disobedient or unruly, challenging her husband's authority. In some regions, as noted in the customs of the Northumbrian shires, a woman who consistently defied her husband with her words could be subjected to the ducking stool, a chair into which she was strapped and repeatedly plunged into a pond or river. The icy shock and public spectacle were meant to cool her temper and wash away her defiance. While a man might face a public rebuke or even a beating for defying his lord, these physical demeaning punishments for verbal offenses were almost entirely unique to women, designed to silence them and enforce their subservience. It was a stark reminder that in 920, a woman's words were a dangerous weapon, and the law was determined to disarm her. Number 2. Insubordination and the breaking of the will. In the intricately woven tapestry of 920 AD society, order was paramount. Every person had their place: serf to lord, vassal to king, child to parent. And within the confines of the household, a woman's place was firmly established beneath the authority of her husband or father. While a man's disobedience to his lord or king was a serious matter, a breach of fealty, a political act, or even treason, carrying penalties like forfeiture of land, imprisonment, or death, a woman's insubordination, especially within the domestic sphere, was viewed with an entirely different, often more chilling lens. Her defiance wasn't just a challenge to an individual. It was an affront to the divine and societal order, a destruction of the very foundations upon which their world was built. Punishments for women were designed not just to correct behavior, but to utterly break their spirit and reassert absolute patriarchal control. Consider Morwen, a spirited young woman from the Duchy of Aquitaine, whose story is briefly noted in the court records of the Duchy of Aquitaine, a collection of legal proceedings from the local lord's court. Morwen, unlike many of her peers, harbored dreams beyond the traditional roles laid out for her. When her father, a minor landowner, arranged her marriage to a much older gruff merchant from a neighboring village, Morwen vehemently refused. She argued, pleaded, and even threatened to run away. Her father, furious at this unprecedented defiance, saw it not just as a childish outburst, but as a direct challenge to his paternal authority, his honor, and his ability to secure favorable alliances for his family. He viewed her as property, and her refusal was a stain upon his ownership. Had a man, say Ragnar, a young landholder, defied his lord in a minor dispute over a land boundary or a hunting right, his lord might have imposed a fine, demanded a public apology, or even temporarily banished him from a feast as a form of social ostracism. As recorded in the capitularies of Charlemagne, whose influence even decades after his death still shaped legal thought in many regions. Disputes among men of standing often involved negotiations, oaths, and economic penalties. While severe, these punishments generally focused on the legal or economic impact of the transgression or on maintaining the political hierarchy. They rarely delved into the complete psychological subjugation seen with women. Morwen's insubordination, however, was treated as a far more fundamental transgression. Her father, with the tacit approval of the local lord, subjected her to physical restraint. She was confined to a small, dark room within their own home, often given only meager rations. Her spirit was to be broken, her will bent to the proper form. She was denied interaction with anyone except her mother, who was tasked with constantly lecturing her on her duty and the grave sin of disobedience. This was not a formal prison sentence, but a deeply personal, terrifyingly isolating punishment designed to re-educate her, to force her into acceptance of her role. The treatise on household governance by the elder abbess Hildegard, while ironically written by a powerful woman, largely reinforced these societal expectations, advising that a woman's virtue lay in her obedience and humility, and that defiance was a path to spiritual ruin. Beyond defiance of a father or husband, insubordination could also manifest as a woman speaking out against societal norms or powerful figures in public, while a man might be chastised or fined for disrespecting a noble. A woman's similar act could be interpreted as a profound lack of modesty or propriety, further proof of her unruly nature. For example, a woman named Alara, residing near the powerful monasteries of the time, once dared to publicly criticize the local abbot's decision regarding communal land use. Her male counterparts might have faced a stern lecture or even a temporary ban from church services. Alara, however, was subjected to a public penance, forced to kneel at the church entrance for days, often barefoot and wearing sackcloth, enduring the stares and whispers of the community. This wasn't merely a spiritual punishment. It was a highly visible, deeply humiliating display designed to humble her and serve as a warning to other women about the dangers of speaking out of turn against authority. In essence, a man's insubordination was often seen as a challenge to power or property, a matter of secular law. A woman's insubordination was seen as a challenge to the very moral and divine order, requiring a response that sought to reestablish her subordinate status through deeply personal, often psychologically shattering and physically demeaning means. Her will was not just to be governed, but to be extinguished, replaced by a compliant obedience deemed essential for the harmony of the home, and by extension, society itself. Number 3. Theft, desperation, and the public scourge. The act of theft in 920 AD was a grave offense, striking at the very heart of the communal and feudal systems that defined daily life. Property, whether land, livestock, tools, or food, was essential for survival and a direct representation of one's standing and labor. Yet the way theft was judged and punished often differed dramatically, based on the gender of the accused, especially when desperation and societal expectations played a part. While a man's theft might be seen as a calculated crime against property, a woman's theft, particularly if it involved household goods or food, could be interpreted as a profound moral failing that shamed her entire household and challenged the domestic order, leading to uniquely public and humiliating punishments. Consider the plight of Isolde, a widow from a small farming community whose tale, though not formally documented, echoes through the village ordinances of Westphalia and the observed practices of the time. Isolde had lost her husband to a sudden fever, leaving her with 3 young children and a meager plot of land. One brutal winter, with hunger gnawing at her children's bellies, Isolde slipped into the local market and with trembling hands pilfered a small sack of grain and a bolt of rough linen cloth. Her intention was clear: to feed her children and provide them with some warmth. Now, if a man, say Einar, a wandering craftsman, had stolen a horse from a stable or a set of tools from a blacksmith's forge, his punishment, as outlined in the Edicts of King Harold, chapter on crimes against property, would likely have been severe. He might have faced a hefty fine to the horse's owner, restitution of the stolen goods, possibly a hand cut off if it was a repeat offense, or even forced servitude for a number of years. These penalties were harsh, aimed at deterring crime against property and maintaining the economic stability of the community. But while Einar's crime was against property and livelihood, Isolde's, even though it involved goods, was often seen through a different lens, one that deeply implicated her moral character and, by extension, the perceived moral standing of her entire household. For Isolde, her act of theft was magnified by her gender. A woman, particularly one entrusted with the care of a household, was expected to uphold its honor and manage its resources, however scarce. Her desperation, while understandable, did not mitigate the perceived moral failing. Instead, it highlighted a perceived breakdown of her domestic duties and her inability to cope within the accepted social structure. The fact that she was a woman, stealing items often associated with the female sphere, food for the tablecloth for clothing, meant her crime was not just about material loss, but about a woman stepping outside her ordained role and acting in a way that shamed her family. Consequently, Isolde's punishment was often less about the material value of what she stole and more about publicly degrading her person, teaching a moral lesson to the community, and enforcing societal norms. She was subjected to a public whipping, not merely a few lashes, but often a procession through the village square, each crack of the whip a public denunciation of her moral lapse. Her hair might be shorn, a profound mark of shame for a woman in that era, and she might be forced to wear a distinctive mark or sign on her clothing, indicating her status as a thief and a moral offender. As noted in the Sermons on Righteous Conduct by Father Thomas, such public shaming was often framed as a necessary purification, a purging of the sin that manifested in the woman's act, and a warning to other women about the dangers of moral laxity and stepping outside their defined roles. In other instances, if a woman stole something of perceived lesser value, like a piece of bread, while a man might be forced to work off his debt or given a lighter physical punishment, a woman could be paraded with the stolen item around her neck or made to confess her sin publicly, emphasizing her perceived weakness. The focus shifted from the tangible loss of property to the intangible loss of a woman's honor and moral purity, and how that loss impacted the perception of her entire household and, by extension, the broader community. The justice system in these cases was not just about restitution or deterrence. It was about maintaining social order through the rigid control and public shaming of female behavior, ensuring that a woman's desperation did not translate into a perceived threat to the established norms. Number 4. The whispers of malice and the curse of witchcraft. In the shadowed corners of the medieval mind, in 920, fear of the unknown festered like a slow poison. Superstition was woven into the very fabric of daily life, and explanations for misfortune, whether blighted crops, sickly livestock, or unexplained illness, often leaned not on natural causes, but on the malevolent influence of dark forces. While men might occasionally be accused of heresy, forbidden knowledge, or practicing a form of black magic to gain power or wealth, women were overwhelmingly, tragically, and disproportionately targeted by accusations of witchcraft or sorcery. The perceived nature of their transgression, their alleged pact with evil, and the resulting punishments were often far more terrifying, violent, and inherently gendered than those faced by men for similar offenses. Let us delve into the story of Rowena, a solitary woman living on the outskirts of a small village in the northern Marches, whose reputation for knowing herbal remedies was as widespread as her sharp tongue. She was known to gather strange plants in the woods, concocting poultices and teas that sometimes worked wonders, and sometimes perhaps did not. When a sudden blight swept through the village's grain fields, followed by a mysterious sickness that struck down several oxen, whispers began. Villagers remembered Rowena's recent argument with a farmer whose cattle were now dying. They recalled her strange mumblings, her isolated existence. They started to fear her. Now, compare Rowena's situation to that of Gunter, a learned man from a neighboring monastery who was suspected of secretly poring over forbidden texts and practicing alchemy, seeking to transmute base metals into gold or to discover an elixir of life. His actions, too, were considered dangerous and potentially heretical. As documented in the Treatise on Demonic Influence by Abbot Benedict, such activities were condemned by the Church as a dabbling in forbidden knowledge, potentially leading to spiritual damnation. Gunter might face excommunication, his books confiscated, or even a period of intense penance within the monastery walls. His punishment would likely focus on the rectification of his spiritual error and the suppression of his dangerous intellectual pursuits. It was a matter of theological doctrine and control of knowledge. Rowena's alleged crime, however, was seen through a different, much darker lens. She was not merely dabbling in forbidden knowledge. She was believed to be actively causing harm, wielding malevolent power, and, crucially for women, often seen as having made a pact with demonic forces. The judgments of the Elder Council of Ghent, a collection of local legal and ecclesiastical pronouncements, makes a clear distinction. While a man might seek knowledge, a woman, being weaker in spirit and more susceptible to temptation, was believed to be easily swayed by the devil to commit acts of pure malice. Her perceived power was not intellectual, but innate, insidious, and terrifyingly destructive. Accusations against women like Rowena often led to brutal trials by ordeal. She might be subjected to the ordeal by water, where she was bound and thrown into a body of water. If she sank and drowned, she was deemed innocent. If she floated, due to buoyancy or panic, she was proven guilty, as the water was believed to reject a pure soul. Or perhaps the ordeal by hot iron, where she had to grasp a red-hot iron and walk a certain distance. The condition of her hand after 3 days would determine her guilt or innocence. These were not rational investigations. They were tests of faith designed to prove predetermined guilt. If deemed guilty, the punishment for a witch was almost universally death, often by burning at the stake. This horrific end was believed to purify the community of her evil influence and destroy any lingering demonic taint. The social factors at play were also inherently gendered. Women who were old, poor, childless, or simply nonconformist were particularly vulnerable. Their lack of male protection, or their departure from societal norms, made them easy scapegoats. Their knowledge of herbal remedies, often the only form of medicine available, could easily be twisted into evidence of sinister practices. The very fact that they were women capable of life-giving and life-nurturing roles could be perverted to suggest they possessed an inverse power, the power to destroy and curse. As early forms of the Inquisition, though not fully formalized until later centuries, local church courts and councils certainly held similar powers. As hinted in the records of the Inquisition began to emerge, they often highlighted women's perceived susceptibility to diabolical influence, further cementing the link between womanhood and witchcraft. So, while a man might face excommunication for reading the wrong book, a woman could be tortured and executed for planting the wrong herb, or simply for having an ill-tempered word with a neighbor. The fear surrounding women accused of witchcraft was not just of their individual malice, but of the threat their alleged power posed to the entire social and spiritual order, leading to uniquely savage and gender-specific retribution. Number 5. Adultery and the stain of disgrace. In the complex tapestry of social norms and legal codes of 920, few offenses carried the same weight of condemnation, particularly for women, as adultery. While often technically punishable for both sexes, the practical application of justice, the severity of the consequences, and the enduring societal shame varied wildly based on gender. For a man, adultery might incur a fine or a formal apology. For a woman, it could mean public humiliation, mutilation, or even death. The fundamental difference lay in whose honor was perceived to be damaged and the pervasive belief that a woman's chastity was the bedrock of family lineage and societal order. Let us imagine the village of Eldoria, a community governed by the local lord and deeply influenced by the laws of King Alfred Uprotund Codex, a legal framework that, while aiming for a degree of justice, still reflected the profoundly patriarchal attitudes of the era. Here, Alara, a married woman, was discovered to have engaged in a clandestine affair with a neighbor, a man named Cedric. The whispers spread like wildfire, reaching Alara's husband, a proud and traditional man who felt his honor utterly destroyed, his lineage potentially tainted, and his authority openly defied. Cedric, as the male participant in the affair, faced consequences, certainly. According to the chronicles of the Northern Marches, which detail similar local cases, A man found guilty of adultery might be ordered to pay a significant fine to the wronged husband, a sum often equivalent to a year's wages or a portion of land. He might face a public beating from the cuckolded husband, or a temporary banishment from local social gatherings. His reputation would suffer, and he might struggle to find another respectable marriage within the community. But his social standing, his ability to participate in communal life, and his physical person were rarely, if ever, subjected to the same level of systematic degradation as Alara's. The legal focus on the man was often economic or a matter of male-to-male restitution for stolen property, the woman's body being seen as belonging to her husband. Alara's fate, however, was far more grim. Her crime was not merely an offense against her husband, it was an offense against the entire social order, a transgression that stained her family's name and threatened the very legitimacy of inheritance. The Bishop Alcuin's admonitions on moral decorum, a widely circulated treatise of the time, stressed that a woman's purity was paramount to the health of the community, and her deviation was a sign of moral decay. Therefore, her punishment was designed to be a public spectacle, a brutal lesson for all women. In Eldoria, Alara was subjected to profound public humiliation. Her head was shorn, a deeply shameful act for a woman, signifying a loss of honor and respectability. Stripped of her head, covering a symbol of a married woman's modesty, she was paraded through the village streets, her shame openly displayed. Following this, she was often banished, sent away from her home and family, forced to wander without support, a pariah. While the laws of King Alfred did not explicitly mandate stoning for adultery in England, some regions, influenced by earlier Germanic customs or stricter interpretations of moral codes, might have seen even more severe physical punishments, leading to mutilation or even death, particularly if the husband felt his honor could only be cleansed by extreme measures. In other communities, a woman convicted of adultery might even be sold into servitude, her very person becoming a form of compensatory property for her husband. The gender disparity in punishment was rooted in the deeply ingrained patriarchal understanding of lineage and property. A man's adultery, while morally frowned upon, did not threaten the legitimacy of his children, who would still be recognized as his, regardless of their mother's faithfulness. A woman's adultery, however, could introduce bastard children into the household, jeopardizing the husband's rightful inheritance and blurring the lines of family succession. Her body was seen as the vessel for legitimate heirs, and her chastity was therefore vital to the maintenance of social structure and property rights. The double standard was stark. A man's sexual transgressions were often viewed as a personal failing or a financial liability, while a woman's were seen as a catastrophic threat to the fundamental order of society, leading to punishments designed not just to penalize but to utterly disgrace and symbolically, if not literally, erase her from the respectable community. Her life, her body, and her future were forfeit to the perceived damage she inflicted on the male line.